It is basically horseshit. The weather was lovely. We have evidence of that. Pictures, marine reports, witness accounts. It was like glass at the time he says this horrendous thing happened. And everything else after that doesn't make sense either. Floated all the way without any power in his 8-foot dinghy, all by himself with one oar, and ended up on Marsh Harbor. Well, guess what, my friends? I'll say you're welcome in advance, because it is entirely possible that if my theory is correct, which is you're full of shit, Brian, she didn't fall off your dinghy, you made it back to your sailboat, Soulmate, where you have been liveaboards for 4 years, sailing around, enjoying retirement. I believe you made it back to Soulmate, Brian Hooker. And if you did, guess what, guys? There are lots and lots of cameras on board that boat. So here's what I've been able to piece together based on witnesses, people who've been on the boat, people who have visited, people who have seen social media, people who have received text messages and photographs and all sorts of things. I can tell you right now, on board Soulmate, there were so many cameras, right? If you're a liveaboard, it isn't weird to have security cameras because you are sleeping on board your home, and it is pretty easy to just paddle up to someone's home and hold them at gunpoint and clean them out, right? Even kill them. Take the boat. So a lot of liveaboards, cruisers, will have security cameras and weapons on board. We've already seen what looks like a samurai sword on board this boat. So that might have been a protective weapon that they had. I would want one with a long blade, keep me away from bad guys. Some have guns, others don't prefer guns, all sorts of reasons. It's sometimes hard to get in and out of, countries with weapons, but cameras wouldn't be weird at all. And what I have come to learn, my friends, is that Brian Hooker had lots of cameras all around the outside of his boat because he would call them up on his tablet or laptop or navigational tools so that he could see navigationally where he was going. He could use the images. This is what family members have told me. He could use those images while navigating. So cameras on the mast, up high, looking around. Cameras on board. And we have discovered, just through imaging, multiple cameras in that pilot house. Okay, so just imagine for a moment, you see lots of sailboats, keel boats, big boats, over 40 feet, even 30, that some people live on. They're not covered. There's the above deck and then there's the below deck. Not the TV show, but the real thing, below deck.
The first thing federal agents wrapped in crime scene tape wasn't a house, wasn't a car, wasn't an alley. It was a sailboat floating under the Florida sun. And somewhere inside that boat, investigators believed the truth about Lynette Hooker was still hiding. Black water, helicopter blades chopping through the sky, Coast Guard radios crackling in the distance while agents stepped onto a vessel named Soulmate like they already knew this story was about to get ugly. Brian Hooker said his wife vanished in a tragic accident. Said the ocean took her. Said the wind separated them in the dark while he tried helplessly to save her. That was the story, at first. But then the Coast Guard launched a criminal investigation. Not a missing persons case. Not a recovery mission. A criminal investigation. Weeks after Lynette disappeared, federal agents started carrying electronics off that boat in evidence bags. Laptops, devices, hard drives, cameras, lots of cameras, mounted above deck, inside the pilot house, possibly below deck too. And suddenly people started asking a terrifying question. What if the boat recorded something Brian Hooker never expected investigators to see? Because Lynette Hooker is still missing. No body, no proof she drowned, no witness who saw her disappear into the ocean. And the deeper investigators looked into Brian's story, the worse it started sounding. Locals described calm water that night. Witnesses said the sea looked almost flat. People nearby reported hearing one massive splash in the darkness. Then silence. No screams. No desperate calls for help. Just one sound that stayed burned into their memory long after Lynette vanished. And then came the detail that changed this entire case. Her daughter Carly says Lynette once told her something she could never forget. That Brian had threatened to kill her. Threatened to throw her overboard so nobody would ever find her. Think about that for a second. A woman disappears in open water. No body ever comes back. Then her own daughter says the husband described that exact ending before it happened. That's the moment this story stopped feeling like an accident. That's the moment people stopped looking at Brian Hooker like a grieving husband and started looking at him like a man investigators may already be building a case against. And Brian didn't help himself, because while volunteers searched the ocean for Lynette, people say Brian stopped searching. While her family begged for answers, he allegedly disappeared from them too. No comfort, no outreach, no desperate public plea to find the woman he supposedly loved. Then came the boat, Soulmate, tracked offshore, monitored from the air, towed back into Florida under federal watch while people stood at the marina recording everything they could on their phones because even they understood this was no longer normal. This was turning into something else, something cold, something ugly, something that felt less like a boating tragedy and more like investigators trying to solve a disappearance without a body. And maybe the most chilling part of all, the possibility that Lynette made it back onto that boat alive. Because if she did, everything changes. Her Apple Watch may have connected back to the onboard internet. The cameras may have activated. The electrical systems may have logged movement inside the vessel. Tiny digital traces, little moments, small things most people never think about, but those little things can bury a lie forever. Now federal investigators are tearing through the timeline piece by piece, trying to figure out what really happened the night Lynette Hooker vanished into the darkness near the Bahamas. And tonight, we're going inside every disturbing detail. The threats, the cameras, the witness accounts, the electronics removed from the boat, the behavior that left even Brian's own friends disturbed. Because the night Lynette Hooker disappeared, her husband blamed the ocean. Weeks later, federal agents blamed the boat. Lynette Hooker didn't look like somebody waiting for her life to end. That's what keeps haunting people. You look at her pictures now, and it almost feels impossible to connect that smiling woman to the nightmare investigators are trying to untangle today. She looked free, really free. Not fake social media free, not vacation free. The kind of free people spend their whole lives trying to reach before time runs out on them. She loved the water, loved waking up with the ocean outside the windows of Soulmate, loved the sound of waves hitting the hull at night while the rest of the world felt far away. Family says she came alive out there, like she finally found the version of herself she always wanted to be. And honestly, you can see it. Every photo tells the same story. Barefoot on the deck, sunburned cheeks, wind blowing through her hair, laughing into the camera like she forgot stress even existed. Lynette wasn't just living on a sailboat. She built a life around it, sewed parts of Soulmate herself, worked on the boat with her own hands, organized things, fixed things, made the space feel like home instead of just some floating shell in the Caribbean. That boat mattered to her. It wasn't luxury. It wasn't fantasy. It was peace. And the people closest to her say she protected that peace hard because life hadn't always been easy. She worked out constantly. Yoga on the deck, weights on board, swimming, stretching in the mornings while the water stayed calm around them. Even in her 60s, Lynette moved like somebody who still had plans for the future. Still excited, still curious, still dreaming. That matters in cases like this, because when investigators try to understand whether someone disappeared accidentally or whether somebody took that life from them, they look closely at the victim's state of mind. And everything about Lynette pointed towards someone still deeply connected to life. She documented everything too. That's another reason this case hits people so hard. There are so many moments of her still out there online. Videos, pictures, little check-ins sent to family. Tiny peaceful memories that now feel painful to watch because nobody knew at the time they were seeing her final days alive. One minute she's smiling into a camera under Caribbean sunlight. Next minute federal agents are wrapping crime scene tape around the boat she called home. That contrast is brutal. And her daughter Carly, you can feel the bond between them immediately. Lynette stayed close to her. Constant texts, photos from the islands, updates from the water, normal mom stuff, warm stuff, human stuff, not the behavior of somebody secretly planning to vanish forever. People online connected to Lynette fast because she reminded them of somebody they knew. A mom, an aunt, a neighbor, one of those people whose energy instantly lowers your guard because they seem genuinely kind. Even reporters covering this case keep saying the same thing. She seemed warm, open, easy to love. And maybe that's why this story started affecting strangers so deeply. Because the more people learned about Lynette Hooker, the harder it became emotionally to accept the version of events Brian Hooker was selling. You start asking yourself questions nobody wants to ask. Would she really just disappear without a trace? Would this strong, healthy woman somehow vanish in calm water, while the only witness happened to be the husband investigators later started scrutinizing? And then there's the silence she left behind. That empty cabin. The untouched spaces on board Soulmate. The feeling that somebody should still be there making coffee in the morning, or posting another sunset photo online. That's the part that crushes people emotionally in this case. Lynette doesn't feel distant. She doesn't feel abstract. She feels present. Like somebody who was just here a minute ago. And when you realize she's still missing, no body found, no final answers, it starts sitting heavy in your chest. Because people didn't just see a missing woman. They saw someone who should still be alive. Brian Hooker told investigators a story that sounded terrifying the first time people heard it. A husband, a wife, dark water in the Bahamas, a dinghy drifting in rough conditions while panic took over somewhere out there in the Black Ocean. According to Brian, Lynette accidentally fell from the dinghy. He said the wind was strong, said the currents separated them almost immediately, said the waves kept pushing him farther away while he desperately tried reaching her. Then she disappeared into the darkness. Gone. Just like that. And for a moment, people wanted to believe him. Because the ocean scares people. It's huge, cold at night, unforgiving. Most people hear woman lost at sea and immediately picture violent waves and chaos and somebody screaming into the wind while nature takes over. That's probably why Brian's version worked early on. At least until people started checking the details. Because the deeper investigators and locals looked into what Brian described, the more his story started falling apart piece by piece. First came the weather. Marine reports from that night didn't show some violent nightmare out on the water. No major storm. No dangerous conditions. No towering waves ripping people apart in open ocean. Actually, witnesses described the water as calm. Almost flat. One person said it looked like glass. Glass. That word started sticking to this case because it completely clashes with the picture Brian painted. Then came the photos. Images taken around that same time frame showed peaceful water. Still harbor conditions. Nothing close to the kind of chaos Brian described later in interviews. And once people saw those pictures, something shifted emotionally. You could feel trust starting to drain away from him. Because now the audience has two competing realities. Brian describing this desperate survival story, and actual conditions suggesting something far calmer. Then investigators looked at location. That made things even worse for Brian. The area where Lynette supposedly disappeared wasn't miles offshore in some deadly open water nightmare. Shore was nearby. The water in parts of that area was relatively shallow. Boats were anchored around A.P. Pat's Bay. People were close enough to hear unusual sounds that night. Which means this wasn't some isolated stretch of ocean where nobody could verify anything. That matters. A lot. Because once a story starts conflicting with physics, geography, weather, and witness accounts all at the same time, investigators start thinking differently. And you can almost feel that happening in this case in real time. Every new detail weakened Brian's version instead of supporting it. That's what makes this chapter so disturbing. Not one giant smoking gun. Just one contradiction after another. Like the story itself couldn't hold its shape anymore. And then there's Brian's own behavior when he explained what happened. The amount of detail, the over-explaining, the constant talking. People who knew the water started listening to him and quietly saying the same thing. This doesn't sound right. Because experienced boaters know conditions matter. Wind direction matters. Distance matters. Currents matter. And according to multiple people familiar with the area that night, Brian's explanation simply stopped making sense mathematically. Then there's the emotional side of it. The part viewers pick up almost immediately. When people tell true stories about trauma, there's usually confusion, fragments, memory gaps, pain. But Brian came across differently to many people following this case. Almost rehearsed at times, like he already knew exactly how he wanted the story to sound. And once doubt enters a case like this, every sentence gets examined harder. Every timeline, every movement, every decision. That's when the audience starts mentally stepping away from Brian Hooker emotionally. Not completely at first, but enough to start asking dangerous questions. What really happened out there? Why does the environment described by witnesses feel completely different from the environment Brian described publicly? And if the water was truly calm that night, then what actually caused Lynette Hooker to disappear forever? That's where this case starts getting heavy. Because once the accident narrative weakens, something much darker starts replacing it in people's minds. And the more investigators examined Brian Hooker's story, the less it sounded like an accident. Everything changes here. Seriously, this is the point where the case stops feeling like a strange disappearance at sea and starts feeling personal. Violence always sounds different once you realize somebody may have warned people before it happened. And according to Lynette's daughter Carly, that's exactly what happened. Because Carly says her mother told her something terrifying long before Lynette vanished in the Bahamas. She says Lynette claimed Brian once choked her, not argued with her, not yelled at her, choked her. That detail alone hits hard, because choking changes the way investigators look at domestic violence cases. Experts will tell you that once somebody puts their hands around another person's throat, the danger level rises dramatically. It's personal, close, controlling. And according to Carly, it didn't stop there. Lynette allegedly told her Brian threatened to kill her, threatened to throw her overboard so nobody would ever find her. Let that sit for a second, because now rewind the entire case in your head. A woman disappears in open water. No body ever comes back. The only person with her is the husband investigators later begin scrutinizing. Then the daughter says the husband had already described that exact outcome before it happened. That destroys coincidence emotionally. Completely. Because now the audience isn't hearing Brian's story the same way anymore. Every word changes. Every interview changes. Every excuse changes. Before this revelation, some people still saw Brian as maybe unlucky, maybe traumatized, maybe just a husband caught in a horrible accident nobody could explain properly. But after Carly's statements, the emotional lens shifts hard. Now viewers start seeing potential intent where they once saw tragedy. That's why this chapter hits like a punch to the chest. It forces people to mentally replay Lynette's final hours from an entirely different perspective. And it gets worse when you picture the setting, because the threat itself feels connected to the environment. A sailboat, dark water, isolation, no witnesses, no cameras nearby except maybe the ones on board. No easy escape. The ocean suddenly stops feeling beautiful in this story. Now it feels like the perfect place for somebody to vanish forever. That's the horror sitting underneath this case. And you can hear it in Carly's voice when she talks about her mother. This isn't internet gossip to her. This is her mom. A woman she believes was scared. A woman she believes may have tried to warn people in advance. That emotional weight changes how viewers connect to Lynette too. Suddenly those smiling photos from the sailboat don't feel as peaceful anymore. People start looking deeper into them, trying to see things they missed, trying to figure out whether Lynette was hiding fear behind those smiles. That's what true fear does in cases like this. It reaches backward. It changes old memories, old pictures, old videos, and Brian's image changes too. Fast. Because once threats enter the story, the audience stops looking at him like a grieving husband and starts looking at him like a possible threat Lynette was trying to survive. Even the ocean itself starts feeling different emotionally after this chapter. Darker, colder, more suffocating. Because now viewers know there was allegedly a threat connected to the exact way Lynette later disappeared. And that's hard to shake psychologically. Really hard. Especially because Lynette is still missing. Still out there somewhere. No body recovered. No final goodbye for her family. Just questions. Questions sitting in the middle of black water that nobody can fully answer yet. And maybe the most chilling part of all is how specific the alleged threat was. Not, "I'll hurt you." Not, "I'll kill you. Throw you overboard. So nobody finds you." That specificity terrifies people because it feels less emotional and more imagined beforehand. More visual. More real. And once the audience hears that detail, Brian Hooker no longer feels like a man surrounded by suspicion. He starts feeling dangerous. Because when Lynette disappeared into the ocean, her family says Brian had already described exactly how it would happen. The first real sign that investigators didn't fully believe Brian Hooker came quietly. No dramatic press conference. No handcuffs in front of cameras. No murder charge. Just time. 5 long days. And in cases like this, time tells you everything. Because after Lynette Hooker vanished in the Bahamas, Bahamian authorities did not simply take Brian's statement and send him on his way. They detained him, held him, questioned him extensively while the search for Lynette continued outside. 5 days. Think about that. That is not the kind of thing investigators do automatically after every boating accident. especially in a tourist-heavy area where accidents on the water unfortunately happen from time to time. Authorities heard Brian's version early. They knew his explanation. They knew the conditions. And something about it clearly bothered them enough to keep him there while they tried to sort out what was real and what wasn't. That matters emotionally because viewers need to understand this. The suspicion around Brian didn't suddenly appear weeks later online. Investigators themselves seemed uneasy almost immediately. And you can feel it when you look at the timeline. While Lynette's family was panicking, while volunteers searched water and shoreline, Brian Hooker was sitting inside a Bahamian jail cell answering questions over and over again. Questions investigators clearly felt needed deeper answers. Where exactly were you? What time did this happen? How rough was the water really? Why does this timeline feel off? What happened on board that boat? You can almost hear the pressure building inside those interview rooms. And remember, by this point Lynette still hadn't been found. No body. No physical evidence confirming she drowned. Nothing concrete proving the ocean took her at all. That changes the way authorities think. Because once there's no body, investigators stop asking only, where is she? Now they start asking, what if she never went into the water the way he says? And according to people close to the investigation, Bahamian authorities never publicly cleared Brian Hooker. That's important, because there's a big difference between releasing somebody and eliminating them as a concern. Those are not the same thing. At all. Eventually Brian was released without charges. Legally, that matters. No charges filed. No public accusation from authorities saying he committed a crime. But emotionally, the damage was already done. Because the public started asking the same question investigators appeared to be asking privately. If this was truly a tragic accident, why hold him for 5 days? Why the extensive questioning? Why the hesitation? And once people learned about the alleged threats Lynette made to her daughter before disappearing, those 5 days suddenly looked even heavier. Because now viewers started imagining investigators sitting across from Brian, already hearing whispers about violence, about choking, about threats, about throwing Lynette overboard so nobody could find her. That changes the emotional temperature completely. Now the detention no longer feels procedural. Now it feels ominous. Like investigators sensed early that something about this story didn't line up with reality. And Brian's behavior afterward only deepened suspicion for a lot of people following the case. Because instead of appearing broken publicly, many viewers felt he appeared strangely detached, controlled, almost impatient at times. And meanwhile Lynette's family sat trapped in agony, waiting, hoping, trying to understand whether she was still alive somewhere, or whether they were already dealing with something far worse. That's what makes this chapter emotionally brutal. Nobody had answers yet. Not investigators. Not the family. Not the public. Just suspicion hanging in the air while a woman remained missing in the middle of the ocean. And the fact authorities held Brian that long tells viewers one important thing. They may not have had enough evidence, but they clearly had enough suspicion. Because for 5 days, investigators tried to figure out whether Lynette Hooker disappeared, or was made to disappear. By now, the case already felt wrong. Too many contradictions. Too many gaps. Too many details that refused to fit together cleanly. But then came one of the creepiest moments in this entire investigation. A sound. Just one sound. Out in the dark water near AP Pat's Bay. And according to witnesses nearby, it was loud enough to stay with them. That matters. Because AP Pat's Bay was quiet that night. Not packed with boats. Not full of partying tourists blasting music across the harbor. It was late. Still. Calm. The kind of night where sound carries across water. And according to witness accounts, people nearby suddenly heard one massive splash. Not small. Not somebody casually stepping into shallow water. A hard splash. Violent enough that it caught their attention immediately. And the direction it reportedly came from? Soulmate. That detail hangs over this case like a shadow. Because if Brian Hooker's story is true, then Lynette disappeared much earlier while they were away from the sailboat in the dinghy. Meaning Soulmate should have been empty afterward. Dark. Still. Nobody on board. No movement. No reason for a giant splash in the middle of the night. But witnesses say they heard one anyway. And once people heard that detail, their minds started going places investigators were probably already considering themselves. What caused it? What hit the water? Who was on board? And why did that sound happen near the boat if Brian never returned there? Pause. That's the psychological terror sitting inside this chapter, because viewers begin imagining the darkness out there. The silence, that lonely anchorage surrounded by black water. Most people have never experienced nighttime on the ocean away from city lights. It is different. The darkness feels heavier. The water disappears into nothing, and every sound suddenly feels enormous. A rope moving, a boat creaking, a wave touching the hull. You hear everything. So when witnesses describe one huge splash cutting through that silence, it becomes impossible to ignore emotionally. And there's something else chilling about it. Nobody reported hearing screaming. No desperate calls for help. No woman crying out in panic. Just one violent sound, then quiet again. That detail alone unsettles people deeply. Because when somebody accidentally falls into water unexpectedly, instinct usually takes over. People yell, splash repeatedly, fight, call out. But according to these witness accounts, that isn't what stuck in people's memories. It was the impact, then silence. And psychologically, silence can feel more horrifying than noise. Especially in a case like this, because the audience starts filling in blanks on their own. They picture Lynette, barefoot maybe, standing somewhere on that boat at night, the dark ocean surrounding her from every direction. No nearby help, no cameras from shore, just black water and isolation. And suddenly that alleged threat Carly described earlier comes crashing back into the story again. Throw you overboard so nobody finds you. Now viewers can't stop connecting those dots emotionally. And whether investigators believe the splash itself proves anything or not, narratively it becomes huge. Because it represents a moment. One possible moment where everything changed forever. One sound people cannot unhear once they know this case. And the timing makes it worse. Because according to reports, this happened late enough at night that activity around the bay had mostly settled down. People noticed it because there wasn't much else happening. That quiet matters. The emptiness matters. Even the small number of boats anchored nearby matters. Because it narrows the emotional focus directly onto Soulmate. The splash almost becomes symbolic in this story, a dividing line. Before the splash, Lynette was still somewhere in people's minds. After the splash, the case starts feeling darker, more final, more deliberate. And what makes this chapter so haunting is that nobody can fully explain it yet. Not publicly anyway. It just sits there in the timeline like a wound. A single violent noise echoing across calm water while a woman vanished forever. And for many people following this investigation, that sound became impossible to separate from Lynette Hooker's disappearance. Because people nearby didn't hear a woman screaming for help. They heard one violent splash, then silence. At first, the cameras sounded ordinary, just another detail about life on the water. People who live on sailboats use cameras all the time. Security, navigation, protection. You're sleeping out there alone in the middle of open water. Somebody can pull up beside your boat in the dark within seconds. So cameras? That part didn't shock anybody. What shocked people was how many there may have been on board Soulmate. And once investigators started piecing that together, the entire case changed again. Because suddenly this wasn't just a missing persons case anymore. Now people started wondering whether the boat itself recorded the truth. And that possibility is terrifying. According to Ashley's investigation and witness accounts, Soulmate reportedly had multiple camera systems on board. Not just one cheap security cam zip-tied somewhere near the cockpit. Several blink cameras, mounted in different positions around the boat. Some reportedly facing the stern, others facing forward toward the bow. And according to people familiar with the setup, there may have even been cameras above and below deck. That's huge, because if Brian Hooker's story is false, those cameras may have seen movement on board long after Lynette was supposedly lost at sea. Maybe someone returning to the boat. Maybe lights activating. Maybe doors opening. Maybe somebody moving around inside the cabin while the world believed Lynette was already gone. And what makes this development feel so heavy emotionally is the daughter's involvement in confirming parts of it. Carly reportedly remembered where at least one of those cameras sat inside the pilot house. That matters because now this isn't internet rumor anymore. Now it's family memory. Specific locations, specific angles, specific details. The kind investigators take very seriously. And once you start mentally mapping those camera angles onto Soulmate, the boat begins feeling less like a home, and more like a witness. A silent witness floating in the Bahamas carrying secrets inside its walls. Pause. That's the horror sitting inside this chapter. Because viewers suddenly realize something deeply unsettling. If Lynette died on board that sailboat, there's a chance technology captured part of it. Maybe not everything. Maybe not clearly. But enough. Enough movement. Enough timing. Enough digital evidence to start tearing holes through Brian's version of events. And investigators reportedly understood that immediately. That's why federal agents became so focused on electronics once Soulmate was brought back. Laptops, devices, tablets, camera systems, hard drives, anything capable of storing data. Because digital systems remember things people don't, or things people wish they could erase. And Brian Hooker reportedly loved tech, loved apps, loved systems. People close to the couple described him as somebody constantly networking the boat, monitoring systems through devices, watching cameras remotely, checking equipment constantly. This wasn't accidental background technology. This stuff mattered to him, which means investigators likely saw enormous potential sitting inside those electronics. Potential timelines, connections, power logs, motion events, maybe even deleted material. And once viewers hear that, the emotional dynamic shifts completely. Now the audience stops wondering whether this case is unsolvable. Now they start wondering whether the answers already exist somewhere inside federal evidence lockers, locked inside extracted files, waiting to be decoded. And there's another chilling layer here. Cameras change human behavior. Everybody knows when cameras are around, which means if something violent happened on board Soulmate, whoever did it may have known they were being watched. Imagine how tense that feels psychologically. A dark cabin, night outside, movement on board. Somebody aware cameras might be recording everything, and still something terrible may have happened anyway. That possibility alone gives this chapter enormous emotional weight, because it suggests panic, desperation, mistakes, a rushed attempt to control evidence after the fact. And federal investigators seem to have treated the boat exactly that way. Not like a random sailboat, like a possible digital crime scene. That's why the images of agents carrying electronics off Soulmate hit people so hard online. Every evidence bag suddenly felt important. Every device felt dangerous. People started asking themselves the same question over and over again. What did the cameras see? And maybe the creepiest part of all, those cameras were designed for safety, for protection, for peace of mind while living isolated on the ocean. But now, the very systems meant to protect Lynette Hooker may become the systems that explain what happened to her. Because if something happened aboard Soulmate, there's a chance the boat saw it happen. The ocean hides things. That's what people always say. Bodies, evidence, secrets. Out there in deep water, things disappear. But technology? Technology is different. Technology remembers. And that is exactly why this case started terrifying people in a completely new way. Because the deeper investigators looked into Brian Hooker's world on board Soulmate, the more it sounded like he surrounded himself with systems constantly recording activity. Not intentionally documenting a crime, but documenting life, everyday life, movement, power, connections, locations, devices talking to other devices non-stop in the background while people barely notice. That's what makes this chapter feel so dangerous for Brian. Because according to multiple accounts, he loved electronics, loved apps, loved networking the boat. People described him as somebody constantly geeking out over systems on board, monitoring things, tracking things, connecting things, and investigators likely understand something most people don't. Modern technology leaves fingerprints everywhere, tiny invisible fingerprints, digital exhaust, and once federal agents seized Soulmate, that digital exhaust may have become more valuable than physical evidence itself. Think about what investigators were potentially looking at on board that boat. Navigation systems, battery logs, engine telemetrics, Starlink internet connections, app histories, Wi-Fi pairings, multiple laptops, tablets, phones, watch data, everything constantly communicating with everything else. And unlike people, devices don't panic. They don't forget timelines. They don't accidentally change their stories during interviews. They just record, quietly, relentlessly, hour after hour. That's the psychological shift happening here. The audience starts realizing this case may no longer depend entirely on witness statements. Now the real witnesses may be machines, and machines are hard to emotionally manipulate. especially federal forensic analysts. Because this is where Brian's version of events starts colliding with technology in ways viewers immediately understand. Take Lynette's Apple Watch. That detail hit people hard. According to family accounts, Lynette routinely removed the watch around dinner time because the battery drained quickly. She'd place it on the charger on board Soulmate. Simple habit, normal routine. But emotionally, that detail becomes explosive. Because if investigators can prove that Apple Watch reconnected to onboard systems after Brian claims Lynette vanished into the ocean, his story takes catastrophic damage. Pause. That possibility changes everything. Because now investigators wouldn't just be questioning his timeline emotionally. Now they could potentially dismantle it digitally. And viewers feel the tension immediately once they understand how connected modern devices really are. The watch talks to the phone. The phone talks to Starlink. Starlink logs connections, apps log activity, power systems log events. Everything leaves traces. And suddenly the audience begins imagining federal investigators sitting in labs reconstructing movements minute by minute. When power activated on board, when devices reconnected, when systems came online, whether someone returned to the boat, whether activity on board happened long after Brian claimed he was helplessly drifting away alone. That's why the evidence bags mattered so much when agents searched Soulmate. People watching online weren't just seeing electronics carried off a sailboat. They were watching investigators potentially carry off the truth itself. And there's another emotional layer underneath all this that makes the case feel deeply unsettling. Brian reportedly knew technology well. Very well. Which means viewers naturally start wondering whether he believed he could outsmart digital evidence too. Maybe manipulate systems. Delete data. Control timelines. But digital forensics works differently now. Deleted doesn't always mean gone. Disconnected doesn't always mean invisible. And every failed attempt to cover tracks can sometimes create even more tracks. That irony hangs over this entire chapter. Because the very systems Brian reportedly loved may become the systems investigators use against him. The apps, the electronics, the networking, the obsession with tech. All of it suddenly feels dangerous. And emotionally, this terrifies viewers because it makes the story feel modern and real. Not some old cold case from decades ago. This feels immediate, current. Like investigators might already be staring directly at digital evidence capable of exposing the final movements aboard Soulmate. And somewhere in all this, people keep returning to one horrifying thought. What if Lynette made it back to that boat alive? What if her devices prove it? What if the systems on board recorded a completely different night than the one Brian Hooker described publicly? That possibility keeps tightening around this case like a rope. Because technology never sleeps, never forgets, never stops collecting tiny pieces of truth in the background. And if investigators are right, Brian Hooker may have erased a person, but they believe he couldn't erase the data. At the beginning, people still wanted to believe Brian Hooker was a devastated husband. That maybe shock explained the strange behavior. Maybe trauma explained the inconsistencies. Maybe grief explained the emotionless interviews. People tried. They really did. Because nobody wants to believe a husband could calmly walk away from the woman he supposedly loved after she vanished into black ocean water. But then another detail surfaced. And for a lot of people following this case, that was the moment sympathy completely died. According to family friend Blaine Stevenson, Brian searched for Lynette briefly after she disappeared. Briefly, then allegedly stopped. Pause. Just sit with that for a second. Your wife vanishes into open water at night. No body found. No rescue. No proof she's dead. And somehow you stop searching? That hit people hard emotionally because it goes directly against instinct. Against panic. Against love. Against basic human behavior. People who lose somebody in water usually become consumed by the search. They scream names into the dark. They stay awake for days. They replay every second over and over. They cling to impossible hope. Even when rescue crews tell them survival chances are low, they keep looking anyway, because love doesn't shut off that fast. But according to Blaine's account, while volunteers and locals searched the ocean for Lynette Hooker, Brian allegedly stayed back on the sailboat, alone, nearly 24 hours passing while other people searched for his missing wife. That image changed the emotional temperature of this case instantly. Because now viewers stop asking whether Brian's story sounds believable. Now they start asking something much darker. Did he already know she wasn't coming back? That question hangs over every second of this chapter, and emotionally, it enrages people. Because strangers reportedly cared enough to search dangerous open water for Lynette, while her own husband appeared emotionally detached from the effort. Think about how disturbing that feels psychologically. Imagine volunteers scanning dark water, calling her name, looking along shorelines, hoping against logic they might spot movement somewhere in the distance. Meanwhile, the man who should be most desperate to find her is allegedly isolated back on board Soulmate. That disconnect is what shattered public perception. And once people emotionally cross that line with a suspect, it's almost impossible to come back from it, because audiences begin watching every move differently afterward. Every interview, every statement, every timeline inconsistency, everything starts feeling colder, more calculated, more emotionally hollow. And there's another reason this development hits so hard. The ocean is terrifying. Everybody understands that instinctively. Even strong swimmers fear open water at night. So if your spouse disappears out there, most people cannot imagine simply sitting still afterward. The human mind rejects it emotionally. You would search until your body gave out. You would beg for boats, beg for helicopters, beg strangers for help. You would not stop. That's why this chapter becomes so emotionally important in the story. It transforms Brian from suspicious into someone viewers begin actively resenting. And the silence around his behavior makes it worse. Because according to accounts surrounding the investigation, there was no overwhelming desperation coming from him publicly. No frantic obsession with finding Lynette alive. No visible collapse. No relentless searching. Instead, people started noticing distance, coldness, withdrawal, and eventually, disappearance from the family itself. No contact with Carly. No emotional connection with Lynette's loved ones. Nothing that emotionally resembles a man destroyed by sudden loss. That absence became loud. Louder than words. Louder than interviews. Louder than excuses. And for viewers following this investigation, that emotional emptiness started feeling impossible to ignore. Because while strangers searched the ocean for Lynette Hooker, her husband allegedly sat alone on the boat. And eventually, the people searching for Lynette started asking the same question everyone else was asking too. Why didn't Brian seem desperate to find her? At first, Brian Hooker talked. A lot. Interviews. Explanations. Long emotional stories about wind and currents and darkness and helpless drifting at sea. He wanted people focused on the ocean. Focused on tragedy. Focused on survival. But then something changed. Or maybe people just started noticing what wasn't there anymore. Because after Lynette vanished, the communication reportedly started disappearing too. And that silence became one of the most disturbing parts of the entire case. According to family accounts, Brian allegedly stopped contacting the people closest to Lynette. No comfort, no updates, no emotional outreach, nothing. And for Carly, that silence cut especially deep. Because this wasn't some distant stepfather she barely knew. This was a man who had reportedly helped raise her since she was little. Years together, family trips, shared holidays, life together on board Soulmate. Then suddenly, nothing. No checking on her emotionally. No grieving together. No, we're going to find answers. Just distance. Cold distance. And when people hear that part of the story, it changes the emotional texture immediately. Because grief usually pulls families together. Especially after something violent or traumatic. Even broken families tend to reconnect during tragedy. People cling to each other, cry together, stay on the phone for hours, share memories, search together. But according to those close to Lynette, Brian allegedly did the opposite. He withdrew, and the silence surrounding Lynette's mother hit people hard too. Because viewers started imagining what that must feel like emotionally. Your daughter disappears. No body found. No answers. No certainty about what happened. And the man who was with her during her final moments stops communicating. That kind of silence can feel unbearable, like abandonment layered on top of grief. And then came another detail that made public suspicion explode even more. Brian reportedly left the Bahamas quickly after being released. Very quickly, despite earlier statements suggesting he would stay and help search for Lynette. Pause. That mattered emotionally, because people naturally ask themselves one question. If you truly believed your wife might still be out there somewhere, why leave? Why create more distance between yourself and the place she vanished? That question echoed everywhere online once the timeline became clearer. And emotionally, It started making Brian's behavior feel less like trauma and more like avoidance. That's the shift happening in this chapter. Not evidence of guilt by itself, but behavior people emotionally struggle to understand, especially because the silence reportedly continued. No major public grieving, no constant family communication, no visible obsession with keeping Lynette's name alive. Instead, people described a man fading away from the people who loved her most. And psychologically, that kind of withdrawal creates enormous suspicion in true crime cases, because humans instinctively measure grief through connection, through effort, through emotional presence. And when someone vanishes socially after a suspicious disappearance, people notice, fast, especially when the missing person's family is still publicly desperate for answers. That emotional imbalance becomes impossible to ignore. One side begging for truth, the other side reportedly going quiet, and the silence itself starts feeling heavy. Every unanswered message, every ignored phone call, every empty inbox, every family member staring at a phone waiting for something that never comes. That's the emotional horror sitting underneath this chapter. Not screaming, not violence, silence, cold silence. The kind that leaves grieving people alone with questions they cannot escape. Questions that grow louder every single day Lynette remains missing. And eventually, people stopped focusing only on what Brian Hooker said happened that night. Now they started focusing on everything he allegedly stopped doing afterward. Because the man claiming he lost the love of his life vanished from the people who loved her most. For weeks, Soulmate sat at the center of this story like a ghost ship, floating evidence, silent, unanswered, the last place Lynette Hooker may have been alive. And the deeper this case went, the more investigators seemed to focus less on the ocean, and more on that boat. Because oceans erase things. Boats don't. Boats keep traces, fingerprints, fibers, blood, data, damage, movement, stories trapped inside small spaces with nowhere to escape. And eventually, federal authorities made a move that changed the entire emotional weight of this case. They went after Soulmate itself. Not casually, not symbolically, aggressively. Coast Guard surveillance aircraft reportedly monitored the vessel offshore, watching it, tracking it, following its movement from above, while people online scrambled, trying to understand what was happening in real time. And suddenly this no longer felt like a missing person investigation anymore. Now it felt like something much darker, because federal attention at that level doesn't happen over rumors. It happens when investigators believe something on board matters. Something important enough to intercept. Something important enough to preserve before it disappears forever. Then came the moment people following this case will probably never forget. Soulmate reportedly lost power offshore. And not long afterward, the vessel was towed toward Fort Pierce, Florida. That image alone hit people emotionally. The same sailboat Lynette helped build a life on, now drifting powerless toward federal authorities. Not as somebody's home anymore. Not as a retirement dream, but as evidence. And when the boarding teams arrived, the atmosphere around this case changed instantly. Helicopters overhead, federal agents climbing on board, evidence bags coming off the vessel, electronics removed, equipment seized, people watching from shore realizing they were witnessing something enormous unfolding in real time. Because this wasn't local gossip anymore. This was federal action. Serious action. Then came the image that shook viewers harder than almost anything else in the case. Yellow crime scene tape wrapped around Soulmate. That image changed everything emotionally. Crime scene tape tells the public one thing immediately. Investigators believe a crime may have happened here. Not an accident. Not bad luck. Not tragic weather. A possible crime. And suddenly Brian Hooker's original story started collapsing under the emotional weight of what viewers were seeing with their own eyes. Because federal agents were not treating Soulmate like a sailboat connected to a boating accident. They were treating it like a potential homicide scene. That distinction terrified people. Especially because Lynette was still missing. No body recovered. No confirmed drowning. No physical proof she ever disappeared the way Brian described publicly. And now investigators were digging through the boat itself looking for answers. That reality created an almost claustrophobic feeling around this chapter. Because viewers started imagining what federal agents might have been finding inside that cabin. Devices, logs, possible biological evidence, digital records, clothing, personal belongings. Maybe traces of Lynette's final moments still frozen in place weeks later. The boat itself started feeling haunted. Not by ghosts, by unanswered questions. And emotionally, people couldn't stop thinking about one horrifying possibility. What if Lynette never disappeared from the dinghy at all? What if the truth stayed on board Soulmate the entire time? That fear sits underneath every second of this chapter. Because the audience understands something important now. Federal investigators don't spend days processing a vessel like this unless they believe evidence could still be there. And according to reports surrounding the search, agents stayed on board for extended periods collecting material from the boat. Carefully, methodically, like people building something piece by piece. A timeline, a reconstruction, possibly even a criminal case. Meanwhile, the public watched from outside the tape, watching agents move in and out of the vessel Lynette once called home. Watching evidence disappear into bags. Watching the dream she built with Brian transformed into a floating forensic scene. And maybe that's the most heartbreaking part of all this. Soulmate once represented freedom for Lynette Hooker. Adventure. Peace. A life she loved. Now the same boat sits at the center of a criminal investigation surrounding her disappearance. And by this point in the story, people stopped asking whether Soulmate held answers. Now they were asking how many. Because federal agents didn't treat Soulmate like a sailboat. They treated it like a crime scene. By now, Soulmate no longer felt like a sailboat. It felt like a locked room, a floating timeline. Every inch of it suddenly mattered. Every drawer, every device, every stain, every missing object. Because once federal agents wrapped crime scene tape around that vessel, ordinary items on board started looking terrifying. And people following this case became obsessed with one question. What exactly did investigators find inside? Not rumors, not theories, actual evidence. The kind that changes a missing person case forever. Because think about what agents were reportedly carrying off that boat. Electronics, hard drives, devices, evidence bags filled with things investigators clearly believed were important enough to seize. That tells you something immediately. This wasn't just a visual inspection. They were reconstructing behavior, movement, possibly even final moments. And the deeper you look into the details surrounding Soulmate, the more disturbing those details become. Start with the cameras. Those cameras changed everything emotionally for people following the investigation. Because cameras don't care about lies. They don't care about rehearsed interviews. They don't care about emotional performances. They record what happens. And according to accounts connected to the case, there may have been multiple cameras on board. Above deck. Possibly below deck too. Different angles. Different directions. Some tied to apps Brian reportedly monitored constantly. That possibility haunted people online. Because if something violent happened on board, there's a chance part of it was captured forever. Maybe movement. Maybe sound. Maybe timestamps. Maybe nothing obvious at all. But investigators know how to pull stories from digital systems ordinary people never notice. And once the public understood that, the boat itself started feeling alive, like it was silently holding on to Lynette's last hours. Then came the hard drives, laptops, tablets, navigation systems, all the digital clutter Brian reportedly surrounded himself with. People described him as deeply obsessed with electronics and monitoring systems on board. Apps for power, apps for navigation, apps for connectivity, everything tracked, everything logged. And suddenly viewers realized something horrifying. A man may lie. A machine usually doesn't. That's why investigators likely cared so much about telemetry, engine activity, battery usage, power spikes, movement records, connectivity logs. Tiny details most people ignore every day suddenly becoming potentially critical evidence. Imagine federal analysts sitting in a room staring at system activity minute by minute. When power turned on, when systems connected, when engines activated, whether devices on board suddenly came alive during periods Brian claims nobody was there. That's the nightmare sitting underneath this investigation for him. Because every electronic system on board may have created timestamps he cannot talk his way around. And then there's the physical evidence. The things people can't stop thinking about emotionally. The dive gear, the tanks, the weight belts. Those details unsettled viewers badly because they transformed ordinary boating equipment into something potentially horrifying. Especially after people started realizing how many heavy objects existed on board Soulmate naturally. Dive weights, tools, dumbbells, Equipment capable of sinking things deep enough that they might never return. That realization changed the emotional tone immediately, because now ordinary objects on board the boat started feeling dangerous, threatening, sinister in the most realistic way possible. Not movie-style horror, real-world horror, the kind built from practical objects people use every day. And then investigators reportedly focused attention on the engines too, especially theories surrounding a possible second dinghy engine. That detail fascinated people because it opened another terrifying possibility. What if the movements Brian described publicly were never the real movements at all? What if another engine was used? What if telemetry data exposes routes or activity nobody expected? Again, tiny details becoming massive. That's how real investigations work. Not dramatic courtroom confessions, not sudden miracles, tiny things, tiny inconsistencies, tiny pieces fitting together until the truth starts taking shape, whether somebody wants it to or not. And emotionally, that's what makes this chapter so gripping. Watching ordinary objects transform into possible evidence. A camera becomes a witness. A battery log becomes a timeline. A watch connection becomes a contradiction. A missing weight belt becomes terrifying. Everything on board Soulmate now feels loaded with meaning. Even silence feels meaningful. And underneath all of it sits one unbearable possibility. Lynette's final hours may still exist inside that boat somewhere. Not emotionally, literally, in data, in systems, in records, in traces people overlooked at first. That's why federal investigators reportedly spent so much time processing Soulmate. Because they weren't just searching a sailboat. They were reconstructing someone's final hours. And somewhere inside Soulmate, investigators believe the truth still exists. And that's the part people can't escape emotionally. After all the interviews, all the theories, all the evidence bags carried off Soulmate, Lynette Hooker is still missing. No body, no funeral, no final goodbye. Just questions, heavy ones. The kind that follow families into every quiet moment of their lives. Because when somebody disappears without a body, grief never settles properly. It just hangs there, incomplete. Every phone call feels possible. Every rumor hurts. Every update becomes emotional torture. And somewhere out there, Lynette's family is still waking up every day, knowing they do not fully know what happened to her. Think about how devastating that really is. No confirmed cause of death. No public arrest. No charges filed. Just a criminal investigation stretching deeper and deeper, while the woman at the center of it remains gone. That uncertainty destroys people slowly. Because humans need endings. We need truth. Even painful truth. But this case refuses to give one. Instead, it leaves behind fragments. A calm ocean. A violent splash in the dark. A husband's story that keeps collapsing under scrutiny. Threats Lynette allegedly shared before she vanished. A boat filled with cameras and electronics. Crime scene tape wrapped around a sailboat called Soulmate. And somewhere inside all of it, a woman who should still be alive. That's what makes this story stay with people. Not just the mystery, the emotional emptiness. Because the ocean in this case no longer feels peaceful. It feels cold, endless, like a place where answers disappeared along with Lynette. And maybe the hardest part to process is this. There are moments in this investigation where it feels like the truth is right there, just beneath the surface, inside a hard drive, inside telemetry data, inside one camera feed investigators may still be analyzing right now. Close enough to almost touch, but not fully there yet. And if you've made it this far into Lynette's story, I need you to do something important right now. Subscribe. Seriously. Because this case is still moving. New developments keep surfacing. Federal investigators are still actively working this case. And the deeper we go, the darker these details become. This community has helped keep pressure and attention on Lynette's disappearance from the beginning. People watching these videos, sharing information, discussing timelines, keeping her name alive. That matters more than you think. Cases go cold when people stop paying attention. So if you care about stories like this, if you care about victims getting justice, hit subscribe right now and stay with us as this investigation unfolds. Because this story is far from over. And somewhere out there, someone knows exactly what happened to Lynette Hooker. Maybe more than one person. Maybe the evidence already exists. Maybe investigators are closer than the public realizes. But until that day comes, her family is left staring at an ocean that never gave her back. An ocean that now feels less like paradise, and more like a crime scene without boundaries. Lynette Hooker disappeared into one of the most beautiful places on Earth. But somewhere between the calm water, the cameras, the silence, and the story Brian Hooker told, something went horribly wrong. And now federal investigators are trying to figure out whether the ocean hid an accident or covered up a crime.